They say marriage is built on trust, love, and loyalty. Yet sometimes the very foundations we lean on can crumble at the worst possible moment. Imagine standing in front of your husband's entire family, pregnant with his child, only to have him expose the cruelest side of himself during a high-stakes will reading that determines both your futures. The shock, the betrayal, the heartbreak. It all happened in the blink of an eye. And no one in that room was prepared for the secret card she was about to play. Little did they know she had been recording every single word, and that one recording changed everything. Elizabeth Beaumont had once believed in fairy tale beginnings. Born and raised in the small town of Cedar Falls, she grew up surrounded by lush greenery and gently rolling hills. Her father, Jonathan Beaumont, was a middle school teacher known for his kind heart. Her mother, Laura, baked pies for every neighbor who showed the smallest hint of distress, ensuring no one ever went hungry in their friendly little community. At 18, Elizabeth dreamed of a life beyond Cedar Falls. She longed for a bigger world, bright lights and opportunities that stretched far beyond her hometown's single main street. She was determined to go to college, become a journalist, and carve out a name for herself. After saving every penny from her part-time jobs at the local diner and library, and with a small scholarship, she packed her bags and headed to Hamilton University in the bustling city of Greenbridge. Greenbridge was nothing like Cedar Falls skyscrapers, shimmering city lights and a melting pot of people all chasing their dreams. Elizabeth felt a surge of possibility course through her veins the moment she stepped off the bus. She enrolled in her journalism program with excitement, but fate would steer her down a road she never anticipated. It was at a seemingly ordinary fundraising gala that she first met Christopher Harrington. Christopher Harrington was a name that sparked awe and envy across multiple social circles in Greenbridge. Tall and striking with sharply parted dark hair and warm brown eyes, he carried the unmistakable air of old money and polished charm. His father, George Harrington, was a successful real estate mogul who owned properties in and around major cities nationwide: Greenbridge, Crown City, Redwood Bay, you name it. The Harrington family was revered not just for wealth, but also for their philanthropic acts, proudly emblazoned on hospital wings, community centers, and libraries. Elizabeth first encountered Christopher at a charity gala organized by Hamilton University. She was there as a volunteer, capturing photos and taking notes for a campus news article. Christopher was a guest of honor representing the Harrington Foundation. He spoke on stage about the importance of investing in young minds, about how the future belonged to the next generation. Elizabeth, enthralled by his smooth confidence, found herself leaning in to listen closely. He exuded sincerity, like he genuinely cared about the cause, unlike many wealthy donors she had encountered. During the reception, Elizabeth stood by a tall pillar near the buffet table, scribbling notes. She looked up to find Christopher approaching, plate in hand, a friendly smile on his face. "I noticed you scribbling away during my speech," he said. "I hope it wasn't too boring." Elizabeth laughed softly. "Not at all. I was covering the event for the university paper." "You have a knack for speaking." They exchanged polite banter. Christopher seemed genuinely interested in her goals and aspirations. He asked about her hometown, her major, her ambitions. Something about him felt both grand and comforting at the same time. By the end of the night, they'd exchanged phone numbers. She felt butterflies in her stomach. This dashing, influential man was paying attention to her, a small-town girl with big dreams. Soon, Christopher began inviting Elizabeth to dinners at exclusive restaurants, introducing her to philanthropic events he attended. She often felt out of place among Greenbridge's elite, where dresses cost more than her entire year's tuition, and conversations casually included references to overseas vacations and lavish business ventures. Yet Christopher helped her feel at ease. He would gently guide her away from prying eyes, whispering, "Don't worry about them. Just be yourself." Slowly but surely she adapted to his world, even finding herself enjoying certain aspects of the high life. Within months, their relationship deepened. Christopher was charismatic, yes, but also gentle and attentive. He listened to Elizabeth's concerns about balancing her studies and a part-time job offering help that she graciously refused. She wanted to be independent, to find her own footing in life. Nonetheless, Christopher's presence uplifted her. He became her confidant, someone to share late-night phone calls with after particularly stressful days. Their differences remained evident. She was messy yet resourceful. He was methodical and had grown up wealthy. But instead of clashing, it felt complementary at first. She saw him as the piece of the puzzle she never knew she needed. He, on the other hand, told her repeatedly that he admired her perseverance, her unwavering honesty, and her humility. At the time, it appeared like the perfect love story, two people from different worlds finding each other. It didn't take long for Elizabeth to meet Christopher's inner circle. His father, George Harrington, was a formidable figure, tall, graying at the temples, exuding the kind of gravitas that made others want to straighten their spines the moment he entered a room. He had a direct gaze that could pin you down. Despite his powerful aura, George showed Elizabeth surprising warmth. "It's a pleasure to meet the young lady who's captured my son's heart," he said, shaking her hand with a gentle firmness. Next to him, Christopher's stepmother Evelyn offered a tight smile and minimal small talk, indicating a hint of wariness. Dinner at the Harrington mansion was a formal affair, complete with a house staff prepared to cater to every whim. Elizabeth, of course, felt a whirl of nerves, but George's conversation helped soothe them. He asked about her background, her studies, and her take on the news media climate. By the end of the meal, she had the distinct impression that George liked her. What Elizabeth wouldn't learn until later was just how many conflicts lay beneath the Harrington household's polished exterior. George had earned his empire through years of shrewd investments. He was known for acquiring land at rock-bottom prices only to transform it into luxury real estate. The Harrington name carried respect, but also underlying controversy. Rumors of lawsuits by environmental groups, local communities complaining about gentrification, and employees complaining about low wages in some Harrington-owned hotels. George handled these challenges with cunning, making them vanish behind closed-door settlements. Despite the controversies, he was also known for lavish philanthropy, building schools, libraries, and hospitals. To many it seemed contradictory. To Harrington supporters, it was a sign of generosity. But behind closed doors there were intense family disputes, especially regarding George's estate planning. Would everything go to Christopher, or would his stepmother Evelyn get an enormous slice? What about extended relatives who circled like vultures, each with their own reasons for wanting a piece of the Harrington pie? Those questions loomed unspoken during Elizabeth's first visit. She didn't know that in a few short years, her life would revolve around those very issues after Elizabeth completed her junior year at Hamilton. Christopher surprised her with a trip to Redwood Bay, an exclusive beach getaway. He rented a private villa with ocean views. One evening, under a clear sky filled with shimmering stars, he got down on one knee and produced a ring. Tears welled in Elizabeth's eyes. Her heart pounded. She couldn't believe that this man, this tall, elegant, caring figure, wanted to share his life with her. She said yes. They embraced under the swirling cosmos, the waves crashing at their feet. That moment was perfect, yet it also marked the beginning of a subtle shift in Christopher's behavior. He became more protective, almost possessive of Elizabeth's time and decisions. Sometimes he'd complain if she spent too many hours on campus instead of attending a social event with him. Other times he would discourage her from searching for internships, claiming he could set her up for something better at one of his father's companies. She would resist. She wanted to carve out her own career. He'd shrug, feigning acceptance, but a lingering tension would remain in the air. Elizabeth chalked it up to normal relationship adjustments. She assumed love required compromise. Christopher was from a different world after all, and was simply unused to her independent streak. They married a year later in a grand ceremony at the Harrington estate, an opulent garden wedding with hundreds of guests. Elizabeth invited her parents, her closest friends from Cedar Falls, and a few from college. She was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the event, the planning, the decorations, the press coverage. Yes, local tabloids and society pages covered the Harrington wedding with glee, describing Elizabeth as the small-town sweetheart who'd stolen the heart of Greenbridge's most eligible bachelor. In the months that followed, Elizabeth struggled to adapt to life as Mrs. Harrington. She wasn't used to staff waiting on her hand and foot. Although she appreciated the perks, it felt stifling. She missed cooking her own meals, driving her own car, and browsing the grocery store aisles with her own list in hand. Meanwhile, Christopher grew busier with his father's business. He was being groomed to take over multiple divisions, and with that came stress and changes in his demeanor. At first, Elizabeth tried to be supportive. She'd wait up for him at night, only for him to return after midnight from yet another business dinner. Their conversations grew shorter, more practical. She reassured herself it was temporary. But the arguments started small disagreements at first about mundane household matters, or about how often she saw her parents. Over time, their friction escalated. Christopher began criticizing her lack of social tact at business events. She insisted she was doing her best to learn. He claimed she was too slow to adapt. A wedge began to form, even if on the outside they still appeared the picture-perfect couple. A year and a half into their marriage, Elizabeth discovered she was pregnant. She nearly fainted when the test showed 2 pink lines. Despite the turbulence in their relationship, she was filled with a surge of hope and love, imagining a child who would unite them, who might help Christopher find a gentler pace in life. When she told Christopher, his face lit up for a moment. He embraced her, tears of joy swimming in his eyes. "We're going to be parents," he whispered, planting a tender kiss on her forehead. The next day, he took her on a private shopping spree for maternity clothes. He seemed excited, but as the weeks went on, she noticed an underlying tension growing in him. He fidgeted with his phone, more often took more calls in private. During a family dinner, he casually mentioned that once Elizabeth had the baby, she might want to step away from any career goals. After all, a Harrington child deserved full-time attention from the mother, and the Harrington resources would provide everything she might ever need. Elizabeth froze, uncertain whether he was suggesting or demanding this new role. She insisted that she could continue to pursue journalism, even part-time, if necessary. Christopher gave her a dismissive wave. "We'll talk about it later," he said. A fleeting cloud of resentment passed through her, but she swallowed it down for the sake of harmony. As Elizabeth's belly grew, George Harrington's health started to decline. He had been ignoring chest pains for months, until one day he collapsed in the foyer of the Harrington mansion. Rushed to the hospital, he was diagnosed with severe heart complications and advanced lung issues. Suddenly, Christopher was confronted not just with fatherhood, but with the possibility of losing his own father. George spent weeks in the hospital, During that time, the extended Harrington family and business associates swarmed around, each desperate for updates. Officially, they all offered well wishes. Behind the scenes, they were abuzz with speculation about how George's empire would be divided. George and his attorneys had been working on a complex will for years, but no one knew its final form. Elizabeth found the flurry overwhelming. Christopher grew more short-tempered, especially after dealing with relatives who pestered him about inheritance details. She tried to be supportive, but each time she asked how she could help, Christopher responded with a scowl or a snapped remark. His frustration manifested in constant phone calls with lawyers, private meetings with accountants, and heated arguments with family members, particularly his stepmother, Evelyn. A few months passed like this each day, marked by tension and the overshadowing fear that George's life was slipping away. Elizabeth worried that the stress wasn't good for her or the baby. She attempted to raise these concerns, but Christopher brushed her aside. "I have bigger things to deal with," he'd say, as if the future well-being of their unborn child was secondary to the business empire. One chilly evening, just as autumn leaves were beginning to fall around Greenbridge, George Harrington passed away in his sleep at the hospital. He left behind a complicated legacy. Massive wealth, philanthropic endeavors, real estate across multiple states, and most prominently, a swirl of rumors about who would inherit what. The Harrington family, always on guard, now had reason to bare their claws. The funeral was a grand affair at a private cemetery, attracting dignitaries, celebrities, and journalists. Elizabeth stood quietly by Christopher's side, her hand resting protectively over her rounded stomach. She watched as Evelyn dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief, as if truly grieving a loving husband. Christopher's expression was stoic, but later that night she found him alone in his study, face buried in his hands, raw grief leaking through the cracks of his composure. "I can't believe he's gone," Christopher murmured. "There was so much more to do, so much I wanted to accomplish before he passed." Elizabeth knelt beside him, took his hand. "He was proud of you," she said softly. "I'm sure he admired everything you've done, and everything you will do." He clutched her hand for a moment, but said nothing. His eyes distant. That night they embraced in bed, sharing a rare moment of intimacy in the midst of chaos. Still, a storm was brewing, one that would come to a head at the reading of George Harrington's will. A week after the funeral, all concerned parties gathered in a stately conference room at the offices of Covington and Shaw, the prestigious law firm that had overseen George Harrington's estate planning. Tension crackled as the air as family members, including Christopher, Evelyn, a few cousins and various business partners, took their seats around the large mahogany table. Elizabeth, 6 months pregnant, sat by Christopher, her nerves twisting inside her. The senior attorney at Covington and Shaw, a silver-haired man named Wallace Prescott, stood at the head of the table, opening a thick binder labeled George Harrington, Last Will and Testament. The hush that fell over the room was almost eerie. Prescott spoke carefully, reading out the standard clauses, first bequests to charities, educational institutions, and so forth. Then he moved on to the distribution of real estate properties. Several cousins murmured in dissatisfaction as they realized they were getting less than expected. Evelyn's lips pressed together in a tight line as she waited for details about her share. Finally, the major announcement. Everyone awaited the primary heir, the controlling stake in the Harrington empire, and the distribution of trust funds. George Harrington has left the controlling shares of Harrington Industries, plus the Redwood Bay estate, and the majority share of liquid assets to Christopher Harrington. A rush of gasps and exclamations rippled around the table. Elizabeth's heart swelled with relief and pride. Maybe now Christopher would be assured of his father's confidence in him. But then came a twist. However Prescott continued, there is a condition that has been placed on Christopher Harrington's full inheritance. He must remain married for a minimum of 5 years, with no legal separation or divorce filing during that period. Failure to do so will result in immediate forfeiture of his inheritance to secondary beneficiaries detailed in Section B of this will. Dead silence enveloped the room. Christopher's eyes widened. Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her interest piqued. Elizabeth sat there stunned. She could almost feel the collective stares burning into her back. The immediate reaction was disbelief, especially from those who had hoped to contest or gain from George's will. Evelyn shot Christopher a look of mingled envy and disdain. The cousins began whispering furiously among themselves. Christopher himself appeared shell-shocked, though beneath that surprise, Elizabeth sensed something more sinister stirring in him. Wallace Prescott completed the reading. Then came the official signing of acknowledgement. The attorneys handed out documents for each relevant party to sign, verifying they understood the will's terms. Christopher seemed numb as he scribbled his signature. Elizabeth's name appeared in certain sections too, acknowledging her partial entitlements as Christopher's wife. When the session ended, the room exploded into chatter. Some relatives approached Christopher with forced smiles, offering congratulations. Others glared or muttered remarks about George's meddling even from the grave. Elizabeth felt a strange dread. She was relieved that Christopher had been recognized, but the condition about their marriage unsettled her. Didn't George trust that they loved each other? At the far end of the table, Evelyn lingered. She locked eyes with Elizabeth, then turned and walked out. A chill ran down Elizabeth's spine. That was the beginning of the day's humiliations. Little did she know that the real blow was about to strike. In the corridor outside the conference room, Christopher was surrounded by a small crowd of onlookers, both extended family and business associates. Everyone buzzed with questions and thinly veiled curiosity about how this condition might affect Christopher's relationship with Elizabeth. It was at that moment that Christopher snapped, letting the tension of the past months boil over in the worst possible way. He whirled around to face Elizabeth, voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Look what you've done. Father's final wish just chained me to you for 5 more years. Is that what you wanted? Trapping me with this baby, ensuring I have no choice but to stay in this marriage if I want my inheritance?" Elizabeth's face turned pale. She felt the stares intensify the weight of gossip-laden eyes, flicking between her pregnant belly and Christopher's enraged expression. "Christopher," she whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "I never—" He cut her off, gesturing almost violently. "Oh, cut the innocent act. You've always known how to manipulate the situation in your favor. Did you think I wouldn't figure out that this pregnancy was a convenient way to secure your place in the Harrington fortune?" A smattering of gasps echoed. Even those who disliked Elizabeth seemed shocked by the harshness of Christopher's accusation. She put a trembling hand on her belly, feeling the baby's little flutters, that felt like the only comforting presence in that moment. "That's not fair," she managed to say softly. "You know that's not true." He let out a bitter laugh. "Fair? You want to talk about fair? When I've just learned my father was playing puppet master, forcing me to remain married to a woman who doesn't understand the first thing about what it means to be a Harrington." Tears slipped down Elizabeth's cheeks. She instinctively shielded her stomach, as if protecting her unborn child from Christopher's lacerating words. The surrounding crowd stood in stunned silence. Some enthralled others, visibly uncomfortable. But Christopher didn't stop. He spat out more hurtful claims that Elizabeth was an opportunist, that she used her charity case background to charm his father, and that she'd never truly belonged in their world. In that moment of searing humiliation, Elizabeth recalled her father's words from long ago. Always protect yourself. If something seems too controlling, record it. It had been a half-joking piece of advice regarding abusive behavior, and she never thought she'd actually need it. But with Christopher's unpredictability growing over recent months, she had started discreetly recording any conversation that felt like it might spiral out of control. She never wanted to be in a situation where she couldn't prove what was said. She had set the voice recording app on her phone before the will-reading anticipating drama from the Harrington clan, but certainly not from her own husband, not on this explosive scale. Now, with every venomous word Christopher spewed, the app caught it all. She realized it might be her lifeline. Her legs felt like jelly, but she maintained enough composure to keep a tight grip on her phone. The final blow came when Christopher, in a voice dripping with contempt, declared, "You think I'm staying with you out of love? Don't flatter yourself. I'm chained here because of my father's twisted sense of humor, and that baby you're carrying is just a further complication." The phone recorder picked up each syllable. Elizabeth's heart felt like it was shattering into a million pieces, but she forced herself to endure, to gather this evidence in case she needed to defend herself. Perhaps there was some faint hope that Christopher would regret these words, that he would apologize, blame it on stress. But at that moment, she felt only devastation and the imperative to protect her future. As the commotion peaked, one of Christopher's uncles awkwardly stepped forward to usher people away, muttering something about a private family matter. Yet the damage was done. Whispers spread quickly through the crowd. Photographers from the local press, initially there for coverage of the Harrington family's official statements, snapped pictures from afar. Elizabeth tears, burning her eyes, turned and rushed down the corridor, ignoring the stairs. She heard Christopher mutter curses behind her, but didn't turn back. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt like a descent into a personal hell, her illusions about her marriage crumbling in the wake of her husband's tirade. She made it outside to the sidewalk, took shaky gulps of air. Her phone was still recording. She stopped it, saving the audio file before carefully switching her phone to silent mode. She had no idea what her next step would be. All she knew was that the man she had married, the father of her unborn child, had just publicly humiliated her, accused her of trapping him, and belittled her background. Whatever illusions she held about a loving union, or that the baby might bring them closer, had shattered. With nowhere else to go, Elizabeth found herself instinctively heading to a small cafe owned by her college friend, Cassandra Lee. Cassandra had been part of Elizabeth's circle at Hamilton University, someone who genuinely liked Elizabeth for who she was, not her married name. She greeted Elizabeth with concern as soon as she saw her trembling form. "Oh my God, Liz, you look awful. Come sit down." Cassandra ushered her to a quiet corner table, handing her tissues and a warm cup of chamomile tea. Elizabeth tried to speak, but her voice came out in broken sobs. Between gasps, she managed to convey the gist, the will reading Christopher's meltdown and his cruel accusations. Cassandra listened quietly, her face shifting between shock and anger. "That jerk," she finally hissed. They spent the next hour talking. Elizabeth calmed down enough to think rationally. She told Cassandra about the recording. I don't know what to do now. He's basically forced to stay married to me for his inheritance. But if he's this spiteful, How is that going to affect me and the baby for the next 5 years? Cassandra gently squeezed Elizabeth's hand. You don't have to stay in a situation that's toxic just because of some will condition. You have rights, especially as the mother of his child. Elizabeth's eyes brimmed with tears again. I'm not after his money, Cass. I never was. But I need to protect my baby. If he tries to claim that I'm incompetent or tries to manipulate me legally, I have no idea what he's capable of now. Cassandra nodded soberly. You may want to consult a lawyer, someone who can advise you, and keep that recording safe. A few days later, Elizabeth mustered the courage to call a lawyer, recommended by Cassandra, someone outside the Harrington sphere of influence. The attorney Deborah Rosenfield was a soft-spoken but formidable legal mind who specialized in family law. Meeting in her modest office, Elizabeth felt a faint glimmer of hope. She explained the entire situation from Christopher's meltdown at the will reading to the humiliating allegations. Deborah listened attentively, occasionally jotting notes. You're wise to have made a recording, Deborah observed. In a worst-case scenario, that's powerful evidence. It proves emotional cruelty and an admission that he's staying solely for financial gain, which could be relevant in a divorce or custody dispute. The words divorce and custody sent a bolt of pain through Elizabeth. She had never wanted this. She wasn't sure if she was ready to give up on the marriage, but she also couldn't ignore Christopher's behavior. Deborah laid out options. She could file for a legal separation or start divorce proceedings. She might also remain married, but lay down legal ground rules about finances and assets, ensuring Elizabeth had enough support for her pregnancy and baby without being beholden to Christopher's whims. The bigger question was what Christopher might do if the marriage was threatened, given the entire Harrington fortune hinged on them staying together. Elizabeth left the meeting feeling both empowered and terrified. The future was a question mark, but at least she knew she had legal recourse if things escalated. She had the recording in a secure location, plus an external backup. She was determined not to let Christopher manipulate her into a corner. Eventually, Elizabeth had to return to the Harrington mansion. She couldn't hide out at Cassandra's forever, though she secretly wished to. Stepping into the vast foyer, she was met by the all-too-familiar hush of staff who exchanged sympathetic glances. Apparently, word had traveled fast about the fiasco at the will reading. Elizabeth found Christopher alone in the study, slumped in an armchair, staring at a half-empty glass of whiskey. The sight of him, disheveled eyes red, evoked a pang of pity. Despite everything, she recalled the man who once held her beneath the stars in Redwood Bay. He looked up, his gaze filled with bitterness. So you're back. She steeled herself, taking a seat across from him. We need to talk. An empty laugh escaped his throat. Yes, we do. My phone's been blowing up non-stop since our little spectacle. My mother's side of the family is having a field day. Elizabeth searched his face. I'm sorry about your father. I know you're grieving, and I know the will's condition came as a shock. But what you did to me, you humiliated me in front of everyone. You accused me of... He slammed his glass on the table. Accused you of what? Telling the truth. You got exactly what you wanted. My father's will gave you the perfect scenario. I'm stuck. If I divorce you, I lose everything. She fought back tears. How could you think I'd orchestrate something like that? I didn't even know about your father's condition until we were both sitting in that room. He shrugged, face twisted with cynicism. But now that you do know, you're not going anywhere. Convenient, isn't it? He stood up, looming over her. Let's be clear. I have no intention of forfeiting my inheritance. If you want to stay fine, you can live comfortably, want for nothing. But don't expect any love or affection from me. This is a business arrangement now." Elizabeth's breath hitched. She had anticipated hostility, but not this cold rejection of their entire history. "What about the baby?" she asked, voice trembling. He sighed, eyes flicking to her belly. "I'll provide for the child, obviously. That's my duty." She saw no trace of the excitement or tenderness he once displayed. The father who'd accompanied her to maternity shops was gone, replaced by a callous businessman who viewed everything, wife and child included, as mere pawns in a high-stakes game. She found herself quietly backing out of the room, feeling her chest tighten with heartbreak and a building resolution to protect herself at all costs. Over the next few days, Christopher approached Elizabeth with a proposition. He suggested they publicly play the role of a loving couple, attend social events together, pose for photos, maintain the facade. In private, they could lead separate lives. "As long as it appears we're united," he reasoned. "No one will question the validity of our marriage, and the inheritance won't be jeopardized." Elizabeth regarded him with a mixture of disgust and resignation. Part of her wanted to walk out, sue for divorce, and let him lose everything if that was the man he'd become. But she wasn't naive. The Harrington fortune represented not just wealth, but power. He could make custody of the child an ugly battle. He had resources to hire the best lawyers, paint her as unstable, do anything to keep control. She insisted on certain conditions. She would have access to her own separate bank account for personal expenses and the child's needs. She would receive medical support throughout the pregnancy and postpartum. And Christopher would not attempt to isolate her from her friends or her family. He acquiesced, too easily, in fact. "Fine," he said. "I don't care where you spend your time, as long as you show up when I need you to." His eyes flickered with contempt. "But don't cross me, Elizabeth. My father may have set this condition, but remember, I still have ways of making your life miserable if you try to sabotage me." She swallowed hard but maintained composure. Understood. The deal was made. They formalized it through a short document drawn up by Christopher's personal attorney, which Elizabeth insisted be reviewed by Deborah. Under that clinical transactional arrangement, they continued living in the mansion, sharing an address, but not a relationship. As Elizabeth entered her final trimester, she endured a dual existence. She accompanied Christopher to dinners and philanthropic galas. They forced smiles for cameras, with Christopher's hand placed protectively on the small of her back. Nothing but a staged display. At home, they slept in separate rooms. The staff, perplexed by the tense atmosphere, did their jobs silently aware that something was deeply amiss. The tabloid press occasionally ran stories speculating on the Harringtons' marriage. Some rumored that the pregnancy was a last-ditch effort for Elizabeth to secure wealth. Others speculated that Christopher was unfaithful, or that the marriage was on the rocks. Elizabeth tried to ignore the gossip, but it gnawed at her. Night after night, Elizabeth found herself replaying Christopher's words at the will reading. She'd listened to the recording alone in her bedroom, tears pooling in her eyes. How had love turned to vitriol so swiftly? She wondered if any of it was truly her fault, or if Christopher had always harbored these resentments, simply waiting for the right moment to unleash them. Whenever she visited Cassandra or Deborah, they reminded her of the power she held. She had the recording, she had legal options, yet she stayed torn by a glimmer of hope that maybe Christopher would come around once the baby arrived. She also recognized the financial security it provided, at least for her unborn child. She wasn't proud of staying, but she felt cornered. In a turn of events, Evelyn, Christopher's stepmother, reached out to Elizabeth. They met in a discreet corner booth at a luxurious hotel lounge. Elizabeth was wary, remembering Evelyn's stony glances. Yet Evelyn came bearing surprising words. "I know we haven't been close," she said, swirling tea in a fine porcelain cup. "Frankly, I thought you were just another pretty face Christopher brought home. But George respected you." Elizabeth narrowed her eyes, uncertain if she was being mocked. "And why does that matter to you now?" Evelyn sighed. "Because I had many issues with George. But in the end, we each played our roles. I see the same dynamic forming in your marriage to Christopher, but without any of the mutual respect or affection that George and I at least tried to maintain. My position in the will is overshadowed by Christopher's inheritance, and I can't help but suspect you might find yourself in a precarious position too." Elizabeth took a sip of her own tea, uncertain how much to reveal. Yet something in Evelyn's guarded tone suggested sincerity. "I'm not sure what you want from me," Elizabeth finally said. Evelyn's lips formed a thin line. "I want you to know you're not alone. If Christopher tries anything drastic, if he threatens you or your child, I can help. George left me certain resources separate from the main estate, and I have connections more than Christopher realizes." She let that linger. "Just keep me informed." Elizabeth was taken aback. Why would Evelyn care? Was this an attempt to sow discord between her and Christopher? Or was it genuine concern? In any case, Elizabeth recognized the potential value of having an ally, however uncertain. Finally, Elizabeth went into labor on a stormy night. Rain pounded the mansion's windows as she doubled over with contractions. Staff rushed to call Christopher, who was at a networking event. By the time he arrived, Elizabeth was already on her way to the hospital. Hours later, she gave birth to a baby girl named Sophia Grace Harrington. The moment Elizabeth cradled Sophia in her arms, all the heartbreak, tension, and fear momentarily faded. She felt the warmth of that tiny body and wept with overwhelming love. Christopher arrived looking haggard eyes flicking between Elizabeth and their newborn daughter. For a fleeting instant, Elizabeth saw a glimmer of the man she'd once adored. He touched the baby's hand, a subtle smile tugging at his lips, but it vanished quickly, replaced by forced politeness. "She's beautiful," he murmured, leaning in awkwardly. Then, with a quick glance at Elizabeth, he added, "I'll make sure she has the best of everything." He stayed for a while, but left soon after, claiming pressing business. Despite her postpartum exhaustion, Elizabeth felt a pang of disappointment. She'd wanted this moment to be about family, to celebrate a new life. Instead, Christopher's departure underscored the void between them. Over the next few days in the hospital, Elizabeth recovered. Family members visited bearing gifts. Evelyn showed up surprisingly attentive, holding Sophia with unexpected tenderness. Cassandra arrived with balloons and a teddy bear larger than the hospital crib. Even some of Christopher's business associates stopped by more out of courtesy than genuine warmth. But Christopher's presence was fleeting and cold. He appeared for brief intervals, always glancing at his watch or phone. It was during one of these visits that Elizabeth overheard him on a phone call in the hallway, talking about her in a dismissive tone, referencing compliance for another few years. She clutched Sophia tighter, anger boiling in her chest. This was what their marriage had come to, an obligation for him, hinged on an inheritance clause. Once Elizabeth and Sophia returned home, Christopher announced they needed to discuss arrangements. It happened in the nursery of all places, a space softly lit by a lullaby lamp. Sophia slept in a cradle near them. Christopher explained he'd be traveling more, expanding business acquisitions in Redwood Bay and beyond. He claimed it was essential for their future. Then, with dispassionate calm, He stated, "It'd be best if we hire a full-time nanny. You'll be free to do whatever you want, but keep up appearances in public." "Understand?" Elizabeth stared at him numb. "I'm her mother. I want to be involved in her care." He shrugged as if it hardly mattered. "Suit yourself. But I won't be here, and I expect you to maintain the public image. Don't embarrass me at functions or talk to the press. Do that, and we can have a tolerable coexistence." She felt something in her snap. "Is that your final word on our marriage?" "Coexistence. Nothing more." A cynical smile tugged at his lips. "Don't be naive, Elizabeth. We both know what this is, an arrangement enforced by my father's will. We can revisit the terms after the 5-year mark." Elizabeth fought back tears. Sophia stirred in the cradle. "What kind of father will you be to her? She's your daughter." Christopher's gaze flicked to the baby. He didn't respond. Instead, he turned on his heel and left the nursery, leaving Elizabeth alone with her heartbreak. Life settled into a strained routine over the next few months. Elizabeth devoted herself to Sophia, occasionally appearing with Christopher at charity galas or business dinners. She stood by him for photographs, wearing elegant dresses that belied her inner turmoil. The press labeled them a power couple adjusting to parenthood. Only a select few, like Cassandra and Deborah, knew the truth. But a dramatic shift came when an investigative journalist, Mark Rodman, started snooping around. He was known for uncovering scandals involving the wealthy elite. He approached Elizabeth one evening, after a gala, catching her alone by a fountain in the venue's courtyard. "I have sources who say your marriage isn't what it seems," Mark said bluntly, "and that there's a bombshell clause in George Harrington's will forcing Christopher to stay married." "Care to comment?" Elizabeth paled, hugging her wrap around her shoulders. "I have no comment, Mr. Rodman." He pressed on. "If you ever want your side of the story heard, my door is open. I hear Christopher has been less than kind." He slipped a business card into her hand before vanishing into the crowd. Shaken. Elizabeth went home, her mind swirling. The next morning, an envelope arrived with old transcripts, photos, and legal records related to the Harrington family. Anonymous, no return address. She suspected Mark Rodman. The envelope contained potential evidence of shady dealings in Harrington real estate ventures, questionable labor practices overseas, and even personal correspondences that painted Christopher in a ruthless light. The final page was a copy of a legal memo referencing George's will proof that others knew about the marriage clause. Elizabeth realized the precarious position Christopher was in. If the truth about the forced marriage arrangement became public, it could tarnish Harrington Industries' spook shareholders, cause havoc. Perhaps that was why Mark was sniffing around, sensing a big scoop. For the first time, Elizabeth understood she wasn't the only one with leverage. A few days later, Evelyn called Elizabeth for a private meeting at a downtown boutique hotel. This time, Evelyn's demeanor was far more urgent. She'd caught wind of the journalist's activities as well. "Christopher is reckless," Evelyn said, pacing the suite. "He's on the verge of making a business move that could damage the entire Harrington brand. If that happens, everything your father-in-law built will crumble." Elizabeth watched Evelyn's distressed expression. "Why are you telling me this?" "It's not as if Christopher listens to me." Evelyn paused, then handed Elizabeth a slim folder. "George Harrington left me these documents as a backup plan. They detail Christopher's potential disqualification from inheritance if he's found guilty of certain unethical acts, especially if it damages the family legacy." George feared Christopher might become too power-hungry. That's why he put the marriage clause in place in the first place. He believed you might ground Christopher, keep him moral. Elizabeth felt a wave of disbelief and heartbreak. George had pinned so much on her ability to save Christopher. She stared at the legal text, which essentially stated that if Christopher violated a moral turpitude clause, control of the empire could shift to secondary heirs or a designated trustee until a new leadership structure was established. "What does this mean for me?" "For Sophia," Elizabeth whispered. Evelyn's eyes softened. "It means you have more power than you realize. If Christopher's unscrupulous moves come to light, he could lose the empire entirely, and by extension, he'd lose his reason to maintain a sham marriage. If you value your child's future, you might consider how to use this information to protect yourself." Elizabeth spent nights poring over the folder. Each new discovery made her wonder if her marriage was doomed from the start. She spoke with Deborah, who was astounded at the thoroughness of George Harrington's estate planning. "He seems to have tried every angle to keep Christopher in line," Deborah noted. With these revelations, Elizabeth was faced with a choice: either confront Christopher openly or find a way to ensure her daughter's security without letting Christopher's destructive path ruin them. She could leak the information to Mark Rodman, the journalist potentially exposing Christopher's unethical moves, assuming the documents were enough proof. But that would spark a massive scandal, sure to lead to vicious retaliation from Christopher. One evening after tucking Sophia in, Elizabeth sat in her own bedroom, the phone recorder in her hand. She listened again to the humiliating scene at the will, reading tears burning as she remembered the pain of those words. Then she stared at the folder Evelyn gave her, enumerating the moral clauses. She realized she could combine these pieces of evidence: Christopher's recorded cruelty, his potential unethical dealings to build a case for divorce custody, and even dissolution of his inheritance if he kept attacking her. But that was a nuclear option. Did she want to blow everything up, leaving the Harrington empire in ruins? She thought of the philanthropic wings at hospitals the schools funded by Harrington money. Countless good deeds had been done in the Harrington name. Did she want her baby's father to become a public pariah? She could imagine the headlines, the social media fury, the lifelong stigma for Sophia. Deep down, Elizabeth recognized Christopher's cruelty might not abate on its own. A man who could humiliate his pregnant wife might not magically transform into a loving husband or father. Still, the heartbreak of finalizing this decision weighed heavily on her. Fate intervened sooner than expected. A month later, Christopher announced a grand development plan in Redwood Bay, one that threatened to displace a low-income neighborhood. Protesters rallied in Redwood Bay, local news channels picked up the story, and suddenly the Harrington name was mired in negative press. Christopher refused to back down, insisting profit margins came first. Elizabeth's phone rang off the hook calls from journalists, activists, acquaintances wanting to know if she supported Christopher's plans. She gave no statement, but her silence only fueled speculation. Then came a crisis. Christopher was recorded on a phone call with a Redwood Bay city official, apparently bribing them for favorable zoning. The tape leaked, and Mark Rodman broadcast it in a scathing expose. The internet exploded. Harrington Industries' share price wavered. Investors demanded answers. Christopher was livid, stomping around the mansion, barking at staff. When he learned from a PR consultant that Elizabeth was being courted for a public statement, he cornered her in the library. "Tell them you stand by me," he hissed, seething anger radiating from him. "If you so much as hint that you disagree, I'll crush you in court and take Sophia away." Elizabeth's stomach lurched, but she squared her shoulders. "I'm not making any statement yet." she replied calmly. "I need to think about it." He clenched his fists, stepping forward menacingly. "There is no thinking. You're my wife. You do as I say." She felt a chill. This was the moment she'd dreaded the overt threat. Her mind flashed to the recording of his humiliating rant and the documents from Evelyn. She realized she held cards, too. If Christopher tried to legally crush her, she would unleash everything. Summoning her courage, she stepped around him. "If you lay a finger on me, or try to take my child from me, you'll regret it," she whispered, voice shaking but resolute. "That's not an empty threat. Remember that." She left him standing in the library, an image of raw fury. That night, Elizabeth called Mark Rodman. They arranged a secret meeting. She handed him copies of certain documents detailing the Redwood Bay bribery, forging them from the materials Evelyn had given her. She also played him snippets of her recording from the will, reading enough to paint the picture of Christopher's cruelty and motivations, but not the entire humiliating meltdown. She wanted to protect herself and Sophia first. Mark listened intently, eyebrows raised at the scandalous revelations. "This is huge," he whispered. "And you're sure you want to do this? The fallout will be immense." Elizabeth's jaw tightened. "I can't let him bulldoze his way through everything threatening me, displacing communities, tarnishing a legacy that once did good. If he wants a fight, I need to protect my child and myself." Mark nodded slowly, an odd mix of sympathy and professional excitement lighting his features. "I understand. I'll handle this with care." A week later, Mark's expose hit the front pages and major broadcast channels. Headline: Harrington heirs secret marriage clause, bribery scandal, and emotional abuse allegations. The article was explosive, revealing the Redwood Bay scandal, insinuating that Christopher was forced to stay married due to George Harrington's will and hinting at emotional abuse in the Harrington household. Though Elizabeth's name was withheld in the most sensitive details, the implications were unmistakable. Christopher found himself in a maelstrom of public condemnation. Investors threatened lawsuits. Regulatory authorities launched investigations into bribery. The Harrington Board of Directors convened emergency sessions to discuss removing Christopher from operational control. In the midst of the chaos, Christopher confronted Elizabeth. She was in the nursery feeding Sophia when he burst in, face twisted in rage. "You did this," he roared. "You fed those lies to the press. How dare you?" He lunged toward her, but she clutched Sophia, turning away protectively. "Don't you dare touch me!" she cried, voice fierce. Staff rushed in, hearing the commotion, but Christopher cursed at them to leave. Elizabeth glared at him. "I warned you," she said, tears brimming, but voice unwavering. "You threatened to take Sophia to crush me. Well, I won't be crushed. You brought this on yourself." He flung a decorative vase against the wall, shattering it. "You'll regret betraying me," he roared, then stormed out, slamming the door so violently that the frames on the wall rattled. As scandals mounted, Christopher's empire unraveled. Suspended by the board and abandoned by investors, he lashed out only to find himself isolated. Then came the twist. Evelyn invoked a clause in George's will, assuming interim control of Harrington Industries. She halted the controversial projects and vowed to restore integrity. When private investigators questioned Elizabeth, she remained poised, cooperative, but careful. At home, Christopher spiraled into desperation, but Elizabeth no longer feared him. Holding Sophia, she knew the power dynamic had shifted. For the first time, she was no longer surviving in his world. She was shaping her own. Elizabeth filed for divorce and full custody, backed by recordings, legal clauses, and Christopher's public scandal. Served the papers, he erupted in fury, then collapsed into silence. "Why couldn't you just stay quiet?" he asked. Her voice trembled, but her resolve didn't waver. "Because our daughter deserves better, and so do I." Christopher, defeated, realized the emir he'd clung to was crumbling not by sabotage, but by his own cruelty. For Elizabeth, this was no act of revenge. It was protection. She had chosen not vengeance, but freedom. And now, finally, she could begin building a life not ruled by fear. In the weeks following the fallout, Elizabeth moved into a modest townhouse with Sophia choosing peace over prestige. With legal protections in place, she focused on motherhood and slowly resumed freelance journalism, spotlighting community resilience and injustice. Christopher, under legal pressure and public disgrace, kept his distance, his once powerful image now haunted by scandal and regret. Though the tabloids spun their narratives, Elizabeth ignored them. Her priority was building a safe, stable future for Sophia. Each day brought challenges, but also quiet victories, no longer silenced or scared. Elizabeth was free to write her own story on her own terms. As the elevator descended, Elizabeth held Sophia close, heart pounding with finality. The man who once promised forever had unraveled before her eyes by his own doing. Later that evening, Evelyn quietly approached Elizabeth. "George always believed in you," she said, handing her a sealed envelope. Inside was a personal letter from George, written before his death. In it, he thanked Elizabeth for her grace and expressed hope that she'd be the one to guide the family forward. Tears welled in her eyes. For the first time in months, Elizabeth no longer felt like an outsider, but like a survivor. Over the next year, Elizabeth rebuilt her life with quiet strength. She returned to journalism, writing stories that exposed the same kind of corporate abuse she once endured. Evelyn restructured the Harrington empire, funding a trust for Sophia's future. Christopher, disgraced and fined, lived in isolation, allowed only supervised visits. Whether he'd truly changed remained unclear, but Elizabeth prioritized safety and healing. Though scarred, she found peace raising her daughter with dignity and purpose. Elizabeth had faced betrayal, humiliation, and power games, but in the end, she reclaimed her voice and gave her child a legacy built on courage, not control. And so Elizabeth's journey from a small-town dreamer to the wife of a millionaire mogul, and ultimately a mother fighting for her child's future, came full circle. What began as a whirlwind romance ended in a storm of legal battles, shocking betrayals, and a fight for personal independence. Yet through every heartbreak twist and high-stakes confrontation, she found the one thing she needed most: the courage to stand up for herself. Her secret weapon, a single recorded moment, sparked the turning point that shattered the Harrington facade. In the end, she emerged stronger, determined to offer her daughter a life guided not by fear or manipulation, but by love and integrity. If you found this story gripping, filled with drama, suspense, and triumph, then be sure to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us bring you more tales of resilience and redemption. Stay tuned for our next powerful story.